All right, welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today, and this one's a little bit heavy.
Yeah, this one's going to be interesting, that's for sure.
Reparations.
Big talking.
Huge topic. We're talking historical injustice and how those things echo through time.
Right. They still have an impact today.
Still do. So we're using this source. It's called Reparations, Arguments for and Against.
Catchy title. Gets right to the point.
It does. And it dives into both sides of this really, incredibly complicated issue.
Yeah, we're going to have to unpack a lot here.
We are. We're talking like huge questions. Like, do we have a moral obligation to actually try to right these wrongs of the past?
That's a big one.
Yeah, it is. And can we even do it practically?
Right. Even if we decide we should, is it even possible?
Yeah. And we'll even touch on some real world examples, like what happened in Germany after the Holocaust.
Powerful example.
Yeah.
Really makes you think about the scale of this.
For sure. So I guess before we, jump into all of that, maybe we should actually define what we mean by reparations. What are we even talking about?
Well, I think what's really fascinating here is that the very idea of reparations kind of forces us to face this uncomfortable truth. The past isn't really past, is it?
Whoa. Okay, yeah, no, I see what you mean.
Like the effects of these historical injustices, things like slavery, colonization, we're still feeling them today. They haven't gone away.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. So how does reparations fit into that?
So at its heart, reparations are really about trying to make amends for past harm, particularly harm that's created these systemic, disadvantages for certain groups of people.
Got it.
So it's about acknowledging the wrong, but then also, crucially, it's about taking actual steps to try and address the ongoing consequences.
So it's more than just saying sorry.
Exactly. It has to be more than words. It's about action, taking concrete steps to try right the wrong. And the source actually lays out some pretty strong arguments for why this is, absolutely necessary. And I think a core one is this idea of historical justice. Like there's this moral obligation to acknowledge and actually try to rectify these past wrongs.
Yeah, that makes sense. But, I think some people might push back and say, well, yeah, but those things happened a long time ago. Why are we still dealing with them now?
Well, because the impacts of those injustices, they continue to ripple through time. I mean, think about it. We've got systemic discrimination that's like baked into our institutions, our policies, and that creates lasting inequalities.
Right.
The source brings up the racial wealth gap as a prime example. Studies show that the median wealth of Black families here in the U.S. is like a fraction of white families.
Wow.
Yeah, and many argue that that disparity is directly linked to, the legacy of slavery and discriminatory policies that followed.
Okay, so that's where the argument for economic equity comes in.
Exactly. Reparations, especially financial reparations, they aim to kind of level the playing field by addressing those economic disadvantages that have been passed down across generations. I mean, imagine if you have one group that's systematically denied access to education, property ownership, fair wages, those disadvantages, they don't just vanish.
It's generations of lost opportunity, right?
Yeah.
Which is almost impossible to overcome.
Right.
But the source also mentions this other, a symbolic significance of reparations.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge part of it too.
What does that mean exactly?
It's kind of like giving a sincere apology, right? It doesn't erase the wrong,
Yeah.
but it acknowledges the hurt, and it shows a real commitment to trying to make things right.
Yeah.
It's like this powerful symbol, like a recognition of the harm that was done. And it can be a really important step towards healing and reconciliation, both for the victims of the injustice and for society as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Acknowledging the wrong seems like a pretty essential part of being able to move forward. But let's be real, there's a whole other side to this debate, isn't there?
Oh, for sure. It's not a simple issue.
Yeah. So, what are the main arguments that people make against reparations?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is practicality. Like, how do you even begin to untangle centuries of injustice?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a logistical nightmare, right? You've got to identify who's eligible. You've got to figure out what form the compensation should take and how to do all of this without creating, even more unintended consequences.
Oh, wow.
Like, imagine trying to trace lineage back hundreds of years. Records are incomplete. Family histories are messy. How do you fairly determine who qualifies without, accidentally creating new injustices in the process?
Oh gosh, that's a great point. And then there's the whole issue of the financial burden. I mean, who pays for all of this?
Right. Critics often argue that the cost of reparations would be astronomical, like potentially crippling for governments, taxpayers. And they worry about it diverting resources away from other important social programs.
Yeah. And there's also the argument that reparations, instead of bringing people together, could actually like deepen divisions in society.
Yeah, this is a really sensitive point, and I can see where they're coming from. There is a concern that reparations could be seen as this like zero-sum game,
Yeah.
like pitting one group against another and potentially breeding resentment instead of reconciliation.
Man, there's just so much to consider here. So we've got these like really compelling arguments on both sides. So as we're thinking about this, as we're like trying to unpack this whole issue of reparations,
Hmm.
what are some of the key questions that we should be asking ourselves? What do we really need to like dig into here?
Well, I think the first one, and probably the most challenging, is eligibility.
Mm.
Like, who qualifies for reparations?
Yeah.
How far back do you go? Do you focus solely on, like, the direct descendants of those who were harmed, or do you consider these broader societal impacts?
That is a really tough question. And I guess, assuming that we can somehow figure that out,
Mm.
there's the question of like what form should the compensation even take? Is it purely financial? Or are we talking about things like education, healthcare, investments in communities that have been historically disadvantaged?
Exactly. That's another huge question. And then there's this question of like, how do we define the scope and the scale? Where do we draw the line? Do we stop at slavery, or do we include other forms of historical oppression? How do you balance like historical accuracy with the need to address inequalities that exist today?
Oh my gosh, there's so many big questions. The source does bring up a couple of real world examples that I think might be like
Hmm.
really helpful in thinking about all of this. One of them is Germany's actions after the Holocaust.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Germany's example is really fascinating because they've actually paid billions of dollars in reparations over the decades,
Yeah.
which shows that, large-scale compensation is possible, but it also highlights some of the limitations, right?
Huh.
Even with these massive efforts, deep-seated societal issues, they still persist, which kind of suggests that reparations on their own aren't a magic bullet. They need to be part of a much larger strategy for social change.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And then of course there's the ongoing debate here in the United States about reparations for descendants of enslaved African Americans.
Right, and that's such a complex one, and we see this debate playing out, both at the national level and at the local level, with cities and states exploring different models, different approaches.
Hmm.
It's a really dynamic situation that I think really highlights both the challenges but also the possibilities of trying to address these really deep historical wrongs.
Okay, so much to think about, so much to unpack. Before we wrap up here, can we just take a step back for a second and maybe like just try to summarize what were the most compelling arguments, on each side of this whole debate?
Sure. I think on the side of reparations, the arguments for historical justice and economic equity are incredibly strong. There's this powerful moral argument that we as a society have a responsibility to acknowledge the past and to try to address these inequalities that persist because of it. And this idea of reparations as a step towards healing, towards reconciliation, a symbolic recognition of the harm that was done, I mean, that's really powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the arguments against reparations, they're equally valid. I mean, trying to figure out who qualifies and how to actually compensate them fairly, that's just incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And we can't ignore the potential financial burden
Yeah.
and the risk of, maybe even making those social divisions worse.
It's tough. There's no easy answers here.
Yeah, there really aren't. Well, I think this deep dive has given all of us a lot to think about, a lot to ponder. Thank you so much for being here, for joining us today as we explored these arguments for and against reparations, the complexities of this issue, and some of those real world examples. And as you're continuing to think about this, to grapple with this issue, here's a final thought for you. If you were in charge of designing a reparations program, what would your top priority be?
Huh.
Would it be about ensuring historical accuracy? Would it be about maximizing the economic impact? Or would it be about trying to foster social healing?
Wow.
Yeah, it's a tough question, but I think it really gets to the heart of what we're trying to achieve here. All right, everybody, keep diving deep.
Keep learning.